Homelessness in California is beyond just a housing issue. A significant segment of the state's homeless population suffer from mental health or drug addiction problems.
The unique thing about the homelessness problem is, especially in San Francisco, the fraction of the population that is estimated to have serious mental illness or substance abuse problem is incredibly high.
In California, we leave our mentally ill people on the streets. That's how we treat them.
One of the hallmarks of methamphetamines in particular is that methamphetamines can cause a psychosis. Psychosis is when people lose touch with reality, when they either see things that other people don't see, hear things, typically voices that other people don't hear, or have thoughts that are inconsistent with reality. Any of those manifestations counts as psychosis, and those are a classic response to acute intoxication with methamphetamines and stimulants, and other stimulants as well. And oftentimes that psychosis can last for a while before it goes away, and it can look exactly like schizophrenia.
What is so dangerous here is that you could walk by someone and you don't know what's going on with them. They could be arguing with someone who they believe is real. And in that process, you could end up getting attacked.
So much of this, at least half of the folks that are out there, either have mental health or substance abuse problems.
Substance abuse is the dominant condition among people who are chronically homeless. Lower boundary estimate would be 70, 80% of the population has had a treatment for a substance abuse issue.
In my experience, in Skid Row, we probably have a higher number of drug users. So I would say as much as 80% of those in the Skid Row area are using drugs. And a lot of them are mentally ill. And so there's a big overlap. A lot of people self-medicate using drugs and or alcohol.
Measuring mental illness and drug addiction presents a particular challenge to researchers, especially when we rely on self-reported information. For example, surveys could ask, do you have any mental illness? Or they could ask about serious mental illness. Or they could ask about serious mental illness that continue for a long time or indefinitely. Same thing for drug addiction. Whether we focus on any drug problems or drug problems that continue for a long time or indefinitely, we will get very different results. For example, in 2019, the LA County government released a report showing 26% of the unsheltered homeless have mental illness and 15% of them have drug addiction. Using the same survey data, but by including a few more survey questions, the LA Times ran their own analysis and showed a much higher prevalence level. About 51% with mental illness and 46% with substance use disorder. The government's estimates are much lower because they only counted people with permanent or long-term severe conditions. Moreover, self-reported data tend to underestimate the mental health and drug addiction crisis. Homeless individuals may be reluctant to report their problems. In some cases, they may not fully understand or acknowledge their conditions.
So look, if you'd come up to me when I was on the street and said, hey, Tom, are you okay? Do you have a drug problem? I would have looked at you and said, what drug problem? I'm just out here chilling. I'm fine. Okay, that's the absolute truth.
The homeless population is very diverse. People become homeless for all sorts of reasons. Some are related to economic hardship, and others might face challenges such as family breakdowns, drug addiction, and mental illnesses. Drug addiction could be both a cause and a result of homelessness. Homelessness tends to worsen drug addiction and mental illnesses.
How did you become homeless? Oh, job loss. I lost my job. How about asking the follow-up question that were drugs and alcohol or addiction, did those things play a role in you losing your job?
Got a job working at Lockheed. Had a 3-bedroom condo, and I was doing pretty good for myself. Until one day, I got around the wrong crowd, and they were doing drugs and alcohol. So I tried it. I ain't gonna say I loved it, but I liked it. everything started spiraling backwards, downwards, calling in sick, but I wasn't sick, using, it got worse that I was using on the job, in the bathroom, disrespecting myself and my coworkers. It got so bad that I didn't want to go to work no more. I gave up on coworkers, family, because I isolated myself and I didn't want to be around no one. It got so bad that I got 3 warnings on my job, and then I got suspended, laid off because of my drugs and alcohol use. The money I got, my money ran out, I lost my condo. And I started living in the streets, trying to do everything to survive.
Anybody who's walked through Los Angeles, walked through San Francisco, walked through Oakland, and you see the homeless camps there, it's not hard at all to identify that the vast majority of the people are not the types of people who, they're down on their luck, lost their job. They can't afford because housing is so expensive in California.
Millions of people leave California or have left California over the last 2 decades to go to other states because they couldn't afford the rent. Nobody decides to go live in a tent in the most dangerous and dirty sidewalks in America because they can't afford the rent.
For the individuals who find themselves on the street because of their mental health condition, their disability, their substance abuse issue, even very large changes in housing costs aren't going to help them as much.
Before we get into the discussion of open-air drug use and drug dealing in some Californian cities, we must first understand Proposition 47 and its implications on crime and drugs in the Golden State. In 2014, California voters passed Proposition 47, which recategorized some nonviolent offenses from felonies to misdemeanors. This includes burglaries and thefts under $950 and the possession of heavy drugs including cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine. Proposition 47 was part of the policy effort to reform the criminal justice system. However, many law enforcement experts and some academics have expressed their concerns over unintended consequences that Proposition 47 has had on property crimes and drug possession. And they're also concerned with how the reforms have had a negative impact on a significant number of people living on the streets. This group is already at a very high risk of drug abuse, and efforts to decriminalize drugs and property crime, a common method for financing an illegal drug habit, have hurt some homeless more than they may have helped. Those who are committing those crimes are avoiding not only punitive measures, but also a chance to receive treatment for their addiction.
Well, we know that some of the low-level crimes that were, a result of, connected to Proposition 47 have definitely been impacted. We know that we've seen tremendous increases in multiple cities when it comes to auto burglaries in particular. We also know some theft-related crimes that we've seen at local shopping stores like Walgreens and CVS have also been impacted by these low-level crimes.
The underreporting is dramatic. So it's very important to understand when you look at property crime overall, you look at property crime since 2014 and how much it's gone up. And you say, well, it's not a stark increase, but it's an increase. But then if you actually dig into the numbers and look at property crime, such as car burglaries or car theft, and separate that out from the other types of property crimes. And the reason why I say separate that out is insurance companies, both here in California and throughout the United States, have had policies for many years that in order for a car burglary to be covered by your insurance, or a car theft to be covered by insurance, you have to make a report to local law enforcement. It is somewhat accurate. I won't say it's completely accurate, but it's much more accurate. Sometimes people don't report to the insurance company because the loss isn't sufficient for that, but it's much more accurate. The increases on car burglary and car theft are staggering throughout California. The other types of crimes are underreported because there's no incentive to make a report. For most low-level offenses, when I say low-level, less than $950, most misdemeanor type offenses, there are specific policies with the retailers to not detain people. And I don't blame the retailers for that. And I've heard some pundits and politicians saying, well, why aren't the retailers contacting law enforcement and letting them know about this problem that's happening? But the retailers know, number one, nothing's going to happen to the person because law enforcement will come out and say, well, the DA is not going to prosecute this, or we're really not going to do anything. They won't get any real time. And the retailer is subject to civil liability for detaining the person.
Videos like this explain it all. Brazen daytime thefts happening at San Francisco stores like Walgreens.
All these different types of stores that in certain jurisdictions, San Francisco's most notably, they will look at it and they make a cost-benefit analysis and say, we're getting too much property stolen from us. The store is no longer profitable. We'll just close the store. In other jurisdictions, they're just increasing the prices to cover the loss that they're suffering.
People recognize that there is no consequences for certain behavior. There is no incentive to stop. But the businesses that are being impacted by this behavior and the losses that they're incurring, I think that needs to be considered as well.
A 2022 survey by UC Berkeley shows that nearly 70% of residents in LA and the Bay Area believed crime has increased.
Most of my neighbors on my block, I would say 3 out of the 10 people have already been home burglarized. My direct neighbor, she walks her dog at the same time every day. And so they must have been watching her because as she left, they came in, it was 2 guys, they saw it on their video and they stole as much as they could. And so that's scary when you realize that people are watching.
So it's now $950. Fun fact, in the state of Texas, Law and Order Texas, the threshold is $1,300. It's higher than California, and that's true in a number of states. If it's under $950, it's still a crime. It's a misdemeanor, and you can go to county jail for a year for a misdemeanor. So if you steal under $950 worth of items, you can be arrested, you can be prosecuted, you can be convicted, and you can spend up to a year in county jail.
Between California and Texas, it's just very different. And so when I hear those comparisons, it was like, well, if we enforce the law as it relates to misdemeanors, the same way Texas does, yes, that would be a valid point, but it's not. It just really misunderstands the differences between the practices within California and the state of Texas. The difference is the way the different systems function. And in Texas, if you commit a misdemeanor crime, you actually will serve some type of jail sentence for a misdemeanor crime. In the state of California, and I've been a prosecutor for 30 years, the consequences for misdemeanor crimes are very low.
When people are issued these misdemeanor citations for these crimes that are below $950, if you would, it oftentimes is stalled in a justice system that is backed up. That misdemeanor court is one of the courts that has a significant backup, which leads to no true accountability.
We do have an issue, particularly in San Francisco, where I think a lot of times the police don't want to arrest people for misdemeanors. That's not a Prop 47 issue. That's an issue that we have here in San Francisco that we need to work through.
The idea that people could continue to commit these crimes without any accountability makes it very difficult for law enforcement, and in some ways is actually discouraging for police officers.
Another impact area of Prop 47 is on drug possession offenses. Under Prop 47, possession of controlled substances, including cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine, is no longer a felony, but a misdemeanor.
I found a YouTube video that referred to Pill Hill in San Francisco, which is in the Tenderloin, Golden Gate, and Leavenworth. I proceeded to go there, walking boot and all, and I found about 6 people selling a variety of different oxycodone or opioids on the street. Everything from oxycodone 80 milligram, 30 milligram, 40 milligram, Opanas, Percocets, the whole gambit was widely available on the street in 2015, 2016. And then over time, my addiction grew. So when I was at my peak use, I was taking 7 80 milligram oxycodone OP80s a day, which is about 560 milligrams a day.
I was on a street the other day, and like it was just like insane. I mean, it was the whole, like every person on the sidewalk was either dealing drugs or buying drugs for an entire city block. I'm like, oh my God, like how is that allowed?
If you don't arrest people for breaking laws, the laws will be broken. So there's a famous expression, right, which is that you get more of what you tolerate. So if you're tolerating open drug scenes and these behavioral disorders, we're going to get more of them. And that's what's happening.
Between 2006 and 2020, drug-related overdose death rates tripled in California. During the 12-month period ending in April 2021, 10,000 Californians died of drug overdoses.
For most of human history, we just did not have the drugs that we have now. If you go to the late 19th century, there's an explosion of developments in chemistry, and that is where amphetamines come from, and methamphetamines, and the morphine, and then cocaine, and after that, in the early 20th century, heroin. Then we get benzodiazepines. We also get new technologies like the hypodermic needle. And then over the same period, the last 150 years, you have the development of global commerce. And so it's like a design flaw, you could say, in humanity that is in a drug-saturated world is causing an enormous amount of suffering.
I'm a libertarian, so I used to believe in the legalization of all drugs and even prostitution. And that really changed for me a couple years ago from living in Venice Beach. And when I see people who are using meth or heroin, I realize that they don't have free will. And so that's something, it's, made me question everything that I've ever thought or thought I knew. And so I'm just seeing that these drugs are just so violent.
The last 150 years is an eye blink in terms of evolutionary history. So we're kind of stuck in this situation where we have a long evolved brain that works pretty well for a lot of things, but is not very good at this particular challenge.
We have open drug scenes, which we euphemistically refer to as homeless encampments, which are places where people gather to buy, sell, and use very hard drugs. This is not marijuana or even alcohol anymore that we're talking about.
San Francisco is ground zero in the United States for the drug crisis, period, in that we have 300 to 500 organized drug dealers working the streets of San Francisco in a 24-hour period every single day.
I rode down San Francisco, and what hurts me is they're young kids, and they could be doing something better.
Young kids in their early 20s already addicted to meth and fentanyl, and they've come here to escape harsh law enforcement in the county or city that they're living in that's more rural. And they also come here for 24/7 ease of access to the drugs that are available on the street in San Francisco.
We need to address kind of the demand side and help people who are struggling with addiction, but we also need to address the supply side with the best that we can.
In the Tenderloin area, it's a central neighborhood in San Francisco, that there's a number of different international organizations that are both, importing drugs and importing people to deal those drugs. And so I don't know how alone we are in that, but it's a very large open air drug market. It's very detrimental, and it does seem to rely on interchangeable, low wage. It's sort of independent contractors that are trafficked. I mean, we kind of look at it sometimes as if it's a little more complex relationship than that, but that they're not making very much money, and they are sort of controlled by the syndicate that brought them here. So we see a lot of people from Central American and that have been brought here and that are trying to deal drugs. And largely now it's fentanyl and methamphetamines, two very strong drugs that are hard to regulate in the body. So we have a large overdose crisis.
I'm not for police engaging with people who aren't breaking serious laws, but 50 people on a block buying and selling drugs, that's not okay. It creates sort of this progression that occurs that's dangerous, in that the more people get used to just being able to do what they want, they'll keep kind of upping their game. First, we saw the drug dealers in the Tenderloin using bats and sometimes machetes, and then they progressed to knives, and now they're using guns.
Open-air drug scenes not only affect drug dealers and the users, but also affect local residents, especially children and teenagers. Research has shown that people are more likely to develop addiction when they're young, so it remains a question whether and to what extent will the frequent exposure to open-air drug scenes affect local young people's likelihood of using drugs in the future.
There are 3,000 children living in the Tenderloin neighborhood. 3,000 kids, mostly BIPOC children. More kids live in that neighborhood than any other neighborhood in San Francisco. They have to be escorted to school by parent volunteers every day and escorted home from school every single day because they have to walk through this gauntlet of open drug use, the open drug scene. They have to walk through it every day. The open air drug dealing, that whole thing.
I remember watching, I just saw on one of the local TV stations, a mom walking a child who looked to be about 5 years old to school down a street in a Tenderloin, and she was walking in traffic on a busy street because the sidewalks were just full of people dealing fentanyl or unconscious from fentanyl. And that's harmful. You know, think of the fear of that mother, the fear of that kid making that journey every day. And that's inflicting, stress and pain on them, which they should not have to endure.
People disagree on how to help the unsheltered homeless with drug addiction. Should there be interventions to get people to treatment? Or should we refrain from intervention in the name of respecting their autonomy and freedom? Should drug treatment be a choice or a requirement?
This person is struggling. They have a problem with drugs. We've made it difficult for them to get treatment. We've made it difficult for them to use. People use drugs as a response to trauma. These people have often lived very difficult lives.
Extreme people with extreme views. They claim to be doing what Europe did, but they're not. Europe does not allow public camping, public drug use, public defecation, at least not at the extent to which California or San Francisco do. It's really victim ideology. It says these people are victims of addiction and mental illness. And then if you go back far enough, they were victims of trauma. And so it would be harmful to make them do anything, to make them take responsibility, it'd be harmful to arrest them. It would be harmful to mandate treatment, even if their illness is what's causing the crimes.
The whole stages of change model, Prochaska's stages of change. I mean, in some ways, it's a very useful model to conceptualize that people have to be at a point in their disease process where things have gotten bad enough that they're motivated to do the hard work of getting into recovery. On the other hand, it's a very pernicious model because it allows us as healthcare professionals and as societies to sort of write people off and say, that person's pre-contemplation. They're not interested, in treatment. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And the truth of the matter is that if you wait for that person to get out of the physiologic state of hyperarousal, which is intoxication and or withdrawal, and again, get their frontal lobes back online, many times people will then say, no, I do want treatment. So we're not ourselves. We don't really have access to our choice mechanism when we're chasing dopamine. But a little bit of a break from that can totally change somebody's perspective on whether or not they want treatment.
Do we believe, for example, that addiction is a disease such that it compromises the person's decision-making fundamentally? So it's actually in their interest, the true person's interest, to intervene on their addiction, even if they initially don't want that. They want to stay on the street and use drugs. And instead, let's say, for example, they mug somebody and a judge says, you're not going to go to jail, but I am going to mandate you to treatment. On the assumption that is, yes, that is impinging the liberty of the person who wants to use drugs, but there's also another person in there who would like to be in recovery and who afterwards would say, as you see, by the way, many people say, thank God somebody grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and pointed me in this direction because I would have been dead.
Mandating by the court that someone stay within drug treatment with a consequence of either flash incarceration or some type of minimal incarceration, that was a very effective tool. The drug courts were increasingly working to get people out of custody, get them in rehab, and keep them in rehab. And unfortunately, because of realignment and Prop 47, there's no consequence now. In other words, the court can say, hey, you need to stay in rehab. But the person says, no, I'm not going to do it. I can steal to support my drug habit. And I know that there's no consequence for that here in the state of California. Therefore, you can't make me stay in the treatment. And I think that the research, in my opinion, and what we've seen across California is mandated rehab was effective and far more effective than what we're doing right now.
Court mandated rehab as an alternative for jail is very effective. There was actually just some data that came out, particularly faith-based incarceration programs are really effective. Job programs in jail are very effective.
Addiction is in fact a disease that does change the way damages the way human beings make decisions. And therefore it is not a violation of people's rights when they're really out of control and at risk of dying to do something about it, rather than stand back and say, well, I just want to respect their freedom to destroy themselves. It's really a philosophical question about how do you nurture someone's autonomy and not violate their rights, and also help them when they're engaging in behavior which is essentially going to annihilate all their rights by killing them.
We're going to intervene. That's the approach that I took, and I was very upfront about it. Why? Because we care about people. We care about people enough not to let them kill themselves on our sidewalks and in our streets, in our canyons, in our freeway underpasses. If we don't have a safe city, we don't have anything. We want safe neighborhoods. If you want, job creation, if you want your kids to be able to walk to school, it needs to be safe.
The 1950s brought two key developments that turned out to have an impact on homelessness. One was the development of a new drug, chlorpromazine, also known as Thorazine, which was the first effective antipsychotic medication. That was followed by a move to deinstitutionalize patients from psychiatric facilities. Through books such as The Shame of the State by Albert Deutsch, the public gained insights into practices at many of those institutions, which were criticized as cruel and inhumane. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act into law. In the following several decades, states closed down public mental hospitals and released thousands of Americans with mental illnesses from those institutions.
There was this effort that we needed to recognize we were institutionalizing people in horrible conditions. They were called mental hospitals, but they really were dungeons, probably, for a lack of a better word.
We went from the top end of the infrastructure that we had for hospital settings in the United States being around 550,000, going down to somewhere closer to about 36,000 for the entire population. So it went from there being, 330 roughly beds per 100,000 population in the country to only about 11 per 100,000 available in the community. So it really was it was a radical shift. It was a lost resource that has never recovered.
Where Europe closed mental hospitals and put people in living in their homes, living with family members and receiving community treatment. Here in the United States, and in particular in California, what we did was we passed an LPS, or a conservator statute, that said only those who are in the most extreme condition, that they cannot care for themselves or others, and they're essentially dangerous to themselves or others. In those instances, we can insist that they remain in rehab or treatment. And so what ends up happening as a result of that is we closed the mental hospitals and the people moved out onto the streets. And they lived in the streets. They committed low-level crimes, and they would get arrested for those crimes. And within a relatively short period of time, from about the late 78, 79, 1980, we went from about 28,000 people in prison here in the state of California to, in the early 2000s, approaching 160,000. Essentially an explosion of people being incarcerated. And depending on the numbers, depending on the studies you look at, between 30 and 50% of those people that were incarcerated were suffering from a significant level of mental illness and or drug addiction. So in other words, we closed the mental hospitals, we put them out on the streets, they committed low-level crimes, and they ended up in jail or prison. In the last 8 years or so, we, out of that recognition, say, hey, this isn't the right thing to do. We've got too many people in custody that are mentally ill or drug addicted. We did things like Prop 47, realignment, Prop 57, which essentially decriminalized the low-level offenses that this classification of people were typically committing, property crimes, among others. And once again, we repeated the mistake of the 70s and 80s. And rather than having some type of appropriate treatment, we simply release them from custody.
If you look at the total number of people who are experiencing homelessness, I would say a third are severely mentally ill, and probably 10% need to be taken care of beyond their volition in the beginning, at the very least. And we call that conservatorship. And yes, that is taking their rights away. It doesn't have to be forever, but if we want to really take care of them the way I would want to take care of a family member, that's the way to do it.
Currently, California has a big shortage of adult psychiatric beds. According to a 2022 study by the RAND Corporation, California has a deficit of about 4,700 inpatient beds for acute and subacute care. At the community residential level, California has a shortfall of nearly 3,000 beds. Altogether, California has a shortage of between 7,000 to 8,000 adult psychiatric beds.
If there were enough hospital beds that were available, you probably wouldn't see people making these calls where people who are still very sick are being released. They're being released because there aren't places for them to go. You definitely some biases and for individuals who kind of assume, well, if this person isn't physically sick, so I'm just going to release this person because I want to save beds for people who have a physical illness.
People don't go psychotic just like that. People start to deteriorate, and it takes weeks before they need a hospitalization.
If you're struggling with schizophrenia and drug addiction, like my friend Sam, who's out on the street right now, and you have necrosis on both of your legs, shouldn't you be intervened upon, or should you just be left to literally rot away on the street and die? He's been taken in at 5150 before, and they always let him back out because either they don't have a place to put him, or he wants out and they let him go, or the drug addiction's pulling him back, or whatever reason there is. But there's no way to hold him longer than 72 hours. And so they let him go back out on the street, and he's out there right now, and he's going to be dead soon.
We're just leaving people on the street to die. That's what we're doing.
There's just a lot of opportunities for a person to fall out of the system at any step along the way where it's not functioning like a system.
You go to a Department of Mental Health clinic, you do a walk-in visit, and they do an intake. The intake takes 3 hours. No one has that. First of all, they're waiting 3 hours. So nobody, if you're severely mentally ill, you don't have that patience. You don't have that ability to say, oh, this is going to be good for me in the long run. And then to get a psychiatrist takes another 3 months. Like, you'll do the intake, you'll get a therapist, but to actually see a medical person, it's another 3 months. So where can you go? You can go to urgent care, but you have to know where are the urgent care clinics?
We have a mental health system which provides a lot of help for people who are willing to pursue it. For parents of troubled teenagers spend all their time thinking about what kind of services can I get for my child. But in the case of people who are either indifferent to services or actively resist participating in services, we're kind of at a loss. And until we figure out what to do about that latter part of the problem, we're still going to have big problems with street homelessness.
For us as residents, people are nonviolent until they are violent. And so it really just feels so risky walking around.
What'd you do? Did you push the woman on the tracks?
Yeah, you got him good. Yes, I did.
Why?
Why'd you do it?
Why?
Why'd you do it?
Why, Simon?
You see them on the streets, or they push somebody in front of a subway train, they fall through the cracks, and that's what always happens. It's like, who's responsible? I don't know. Is it the local Department of Homeless Services? Is it the County Department of Mental Health? I don't know. We need to think about ways to, within the larger civil liberties context, make, exceptions or modifications for people who, we really think if we're just going to provide them with absolute respect for their freedom, that they're going to deteriorate.
I don't think we should criminalize either addiction or mental illness. I think it's sad, actually, that we probably can't figure out a way to do that. But I just think America in particular, we love our freedom so much. It's going to be very hard to compel that. So it means I think you have to wait until the person commits a crime.
We need to invest far more in inpatient psychiatric hospital beds than we do. And involuntary, in the case of people who we don't think necessarily need involuntary treatment, we need to make more use of community-based forms of involuntary treatment, such as Laura's Law or conservatorships.
Not everybody that's mentally ill is Britney Spears, okay? Most people that are mentally ill, that are out there on the street, yeah, they need intervention. And you're going to take that tool away. Man, forget about it. Once you do that, it's going to be really, really hard to help that subset of the population get help.
We had a woman in our community that was just terrorizing the community, and she was a danger to herself and the people around her. She was setting fires on people's houses. She was, assaulting people on a regular basis. She'd actually walk into our health center and steal things and threaten people. And, so she had some severe mental health problems and drug addictions. And so we were able to get her kind of into an involuntary program. And there are times when you just have to do that. I think we need to have a robust political conversation about how to do that without infringing on people's rights.
When you look at some of the policies, for example, in California, things like the Lanterman and Petra Short Act that puts a very high threshold in order to compel folks with mental illness and psychosis to be held against their will. Now you've got state lawmakers saying, the thresholds of Lanterman and Petra Short are too high. We're unable to actually compel people to get off the street who need it the most, the ones that are gravely disabled.
That has been abused in the past. And, particularly there's been a lot of racial abuse of those kinds of policies, so I am concerned about that. So I think that needs a really robust public conversation, but it does need to happen.
It's often sensitive to talk about mental illness and drug addiction problems among the homeless population because some people think that's going to stigmatize the homeless or divert attention away from building more housing.
If you really are objective and you set all preconceived notions aside, what you're going to see, this is a drug and mental illness problem. And that's it. To deny that and to call it something else, it's not just being unrealistic, but it's also you're being unhelpful. You're not addressing the real need, the real crisis. And that is beyond wrong. It is immoral. It is absolutely immoral to ignore the suffering and the death, not just of individuals, but of a city, right? Of communities, of small business owners, of residents, of visitors. You have to call it what it is. If you don't, you're on the wrong side.
We can't solve this all by ourselves as a city, but I think what we can do is just keep using data, keep using common sense, get the politics out of it. If we can't be honest and just say the truth and use data and common sense and our eyeballs, we are never going to solve this problem.